you. If you want to turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel 14, 1 Samuel 14, that's where we're going to be working out of this morning. I want to say one other thing before we get started, which is after the announcements, we're going to circle up, and I made the announcement last week that Olivia Vander was baptized, but we'll have a prayer for her at the end of service, so I just want to remind you of that coming your way here shortly. I have tried to make it a practice in preaching that usually it lands in the summer sometime of spending some time thinking about families, and sometimes that revolves around parenting or marriage or whatever the subject might be. This morning's lesson is really pertinent to parents, but it's also really important for leaders. So everybody's a leader. You're always leading somebody, no matter where you're at in your life. And so this is an important subject for really anybody. But if you're a parent this morning, I want to encourage you to hear maybe the message through the lens of parenting. And I'll use sort of parental language as we go, but notice that all of our lesson can kind of be tied back into this idea of leadership. I want to talk to you this morning about one of the strangest chapters in the Bible as far as drama goes. I mean, this is like you're watching made-for-TV drama unfolding. Every paragraph is a new chaotic disaster. I mean, it's just such a crazy chapter and sequence of events in 1 Samuel 14. There was a time, maybe it was 2 years ago, I don't know, where we spent some time looking at kind of the first third of this story. We're going to spend more of our time talking about the other 2/3 this morning. But I'd like to really begin by just walking you through what happens in 1 Samuel chapter 14. And what I need to tell you kind of as a way of setting the stage is Israel is at war with the Philistines. They are basically encamped up on this hillside ready to attack, and the Israelites are down off on the other side. And you find out that King Saul he's the king of Israel, and he's not really sure what to do. He's hanging out, hiding out amongst the pomegranate trees and pomegranate caves in 1 Samuel 14 verse 2. Anyway, the scene is not looking particularly good. Saul has actually, as king, made some pretty bad decisions just in the last chapter or two, and Samuel has confronted him about that and let him know that God is certainly not pleased with the way that he has handled some things. Anyway, all of that to say, they're kind of in a pretty bad position here. King Saul and his son Jonathan and about 600 men. And so, what are they going to do? The story goes that Jonathan, and basically this is the first third of the story, Jonathan engages in this daring solo mission. I say solo. What I mean is he's going without his father's knowledge. He's going without an army. He's just going with himself, and his armor bearer is going to go with him to try to see if they will engage the Philistine enemy in conflict. So the king is sort of crippled with inaction, but Jonathan says, let's see what we need to do. And so Jonathan tells his armor bearer, he says, we're gonna go and we're going to engage in conflict if we come out onto this, they're going to sort of have to scale a craggy sort of cliff face on this hill. They say, as we're coming up, if they look down and say, come on up, then we'll know that God's given them into our hands. And if they say, we'll come down to you, not the case. But they're ready to engage in this conflict. And so Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. You see this sort of valiant and heroic faith of Jonathan in this declaration. And this is 2 years ago, we talked about that expression that he says there, it may be that Jonathan was so passionate about the mission of God that he was saying, even if I have to be redirected, I want to do something. I want to act on behalf of the Lord. And he says, if God's going to be with us, He'll make that clear. And if we need to do something else, He'll make that clear. But he's ready to act, even act alone. So as the story goes, they do call up Jonathan and the armor bearer from the side of the hill. And it's so fascinating if you look at the text of 1 Samuel 14. It basically says that as they come up, the Lord causes a spirit of confusion, I guess you might say, to rush upon these Philistines, and they're actually falling over in front of Jonathan. You actually don't read in this passage where Jonathan himself slays anybody in this conflict. It says that they're falling down, and the armor bearer is coming behind Jonathan, and he's eliminating the threats. And so you see this act of God in delivering Jonathan and the armor bearer and all of that. In the end, in verse 15 of 1 Samuel 14, there's this wild panic that is taking place in the Philistine camp. They don't know what's going on. Obviously, there's been something divine happening, and so they're afraid. They're not sure what to do. There's actually an earthquake that goes on in verse 15, and it says it became a very great panic. A very great panic. All right, that's the first sort of third of the drama, right? Daring rescue mission from Jonathan, Prince of Israel, amazing. Then we get into a series of Saul's chaotic decisions. His rash decisions, his unwise choices. I don't really know what you want to call them, but Saul, he can tell that the enemy camp is in a state of chaos. So you would think what he would do would say, well, let's go engage them in conflict. But he doesn't do that. First he says, somebody tell me who went over there. Somebody went over there. So in verse 17, he's going to say, tell me who went over there to the camp, and we'll see if we can find out who's over there. Jonathan's over there. So if you discover that your son has gone into conflict with the enemy, what would you do as the commander of the army? And they're in a state of chaos. Jonathan's winning, it's working. He says, Bring the ark to me. I want to, inquire of the Lord if this is the right thing to do or not. This is in 1 Samuel 14, verses 17 and following. In verse 18, he says, bring the ark of God here. So I guess the guy's carrying the ark, the priest or whatever. Maybe they're coming up slowly. I don't know what it is. But he's talking with the priest, and he says, just stop calling for the ark now. Let's just go into battle. They're in chaos. Let's go. So you see that you have this leader who is not sure really what to be doing. And so he decides in verse 19, withdraw your hand. We don't need the ark. Let's just go in to battle. And sure enough, the Lord delivers the Philistine army into their hands. It says in verse 23, the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth Aven. And so Saul doesn't really know to go into battle or to not, but they do, and it works out. But then he makes another odd choice in verse 24. And the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. There you go. The men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. So Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, they just got done fighting this army in a battle, a huge battle. They're not like, these are guys using swords and spears and shields and stuff. This is not like an easy activity, And he says, don't eat anything. Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening. And, okay, there's an extra qualification, and I am avenged on my enemies. So none of the people had tasted food. See how Saul just made this conflict about him all of a sudden? This is an aside, but Saul's going to have the same problem in a sense in this chapter with Jonathan as he's going to have with David later. Because one of the things about David that made Saul so furious was that when they would go off into battle, the ladies would start singing, "Saul has killed his thousands." Sounds pretty good if you're a warrior, but David has killed his 10,000s. Here he says, nobody's going to taste a bit of food until I am avenged on my enemies. On my enemies. God makes it pretty clear to the people in the Old Testament as they're engaged in this conflict. What matters is not who your enemies are or who your friends are. What matters is who my enemies are, right? God is the one who sets the agenda, and yet Saul is presumptuously saying, this is my enemies, and it's my call. None of you are going to eat anything, even though you just fought in a war, until I am avenged. And the sun goes down. This leads to all kinds of further chaos. Now, this seems like a simple little choice, right? I mean, he's just saying don't eat anything. In and of itself, maybe you say that doesn't make sense, but this is just kind of a little thing, right? I mean, they're really hungry, but this is not like he's making some crazy law that's going to be going on forever about he's going to raise the taxes to 80%, He just says, don't eat today. But that rash decision, that hasty vow, has massive rippling consequences for his family and for the people of Israel. So, Saul makes this decision. They don't taste food, and the text says that they are fatigued. They are, exceedingly weary. And they come into the forest. And as they come into the forest, they notice that the forest is filled with honey. Filled with honey. But they've all been told, you can't have any food. Don't you dare eat that honey, even though you've been fighting in the battle. Rejuvenate your strength. Don't do it. I'm going to show you a picture. I don't know if you can see this super well, but, and maybe I've talked about this place before, I don't know. This is Lake Hunky Dory, or Hunky Dory Lake in Colorado. It sits at about 12,000 feet elevation. When I was like 10 or 11 or 12, I had the opportunity to hike up here. It was as empty as it looks in this picture, okay? There was nobody there except the 8 of us from church that were on this hike. But it was a guy's hike trip. But anyway, as we were getting ready to set out up this mountain, the guy, the main leader of our trip, he had these huge bags of caramel squares. I guess most of y'all say caramel, but I say caramel. But anyway, I think you're actually right, but that's how I say it. But he had these huge bags of caramel squares. They were just pure sugar basically in a cube. And he was going around and he was making sure all of us, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, that our pockets were just filled with caramel squares for this hike. And he said, I want you to do 2 things as we're walking up here. Constantly be drinking water, and if you start to get tired, eat some caramel. Now, whether that's scientifically accurate or not about what you should do, it worked for me, okay? I'm walking up there, I'm thinking this is not too bad, caramel. It's the same thing here, though, right? They've expended a ton of energy in this battle, and they have a chance to be rejuvenated by not caramel, but by honey, and yet they're unable to because the king has determined that they not eat of it. And he told everybody about that rule except the one person who actually was responsible for their victory, outside of course, the divine intervention from God, which would be Jonathan. Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath, so he put out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. He was rejuvenated by partaking of this honey that he finds in the forest. And they're very worried about this. They're worried that he has, he's broken the oath that his father made everyone take. Jonathan in verse 29 says something really, it would be viewed as well, forbidden speech, to question the king, right? And to really say that the king's plans are not worth anything. Jonathan said, verse 29, "My father has troubled the land." In other words, my dad doesn't know what he's doing right now. He's forbidden us to eat what is good in the land. See, look how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. He says, my father didn't know what he was talking about. He made a decision that was made at the wrong time and for the wrong reasons. And now the people are suffering. You keep going, and the people are going to, sorry, I should have put that on the screen. The people are going to fall into more chaos because of this. They're so hungry that they are driven, as Saul wants to keep going into battle, they're driven to strike down the Philistines. In verse 31, they go from a place called Michmash all the way to Aijalon, and it says the people were very faint. So faint that they saw some sheep and cattle, and they began, basically eating them without cooking them. They ate them with the blood, is the way the text renders it, because they were so weary from their fighting. Well, God in the law had specifically forbidden that behavior, right? He had said, we're not going to act like the pagans do, that don't actually, cook their meat, that they eat it with the blood and all of that. There's specific reasons for that. We don't need to get into all of that. Anyway, they're doing this, and Saul is furious with his army. He says, how dare you break the law of God by doing this? Who do you think you are? Saul wants to know. Still, he's like, let's go back into battle anyway. So he says in verse, basically, if you look at verse 33, that's when their argument kind of begins, and he's going to build an altar. But in verse 36, he says, let's go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them. And they said, and notice the way the people talk to Saul, do whatever seems good to you. That doesn't sound like a blanket endorsement to me. It sounds like you're the king. The priest said, Saul, maybe we should draw near to God here. Maybe we should consult him. So Saul says, okay, well, we'll talk to God about it. But the Lord didn't answer, okay? Here you see it. Saul inquired of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him that day. So Saul, he's gone knocking, he's gone asking God, are you going to deliver them into our hands when we go into battle? And he doesn't hear an answer. And do you know what Saul's conclusion from that is? The people who were eating that meat, they did this. Their choices led God to not give me an answer today. This is their sin. So confident is Saul that he gets Jonathan, his son, and he brings him over here, and he and Jonathan stand on this side of the hill, and then he gets the rest of the people, the army of Israel, and he situates them over on that side of the hill, and he says, I tell you what, we're going to cast lots, and we're going to find out which one of these two groups of people has done the thing that has prevented the answer of God for me. And this is what he says in verse 39, for as the Lord lives who saves Israel, if it might be, though it be in Jonathan my son, then he shall surely die. But look at this. But there was not a man among all the people who answered him. Again, the people are going, what is wrong with this guy? They're just sitting there going, okay, if that's the plan that you have, that'll be the plan. He says, even if my son is the one who's done this, because he ate the honey even though he didn't know, then I'll kill him. Well, guess what? They start casting the lots. The lot falls on Saul and Jonathan. And to do it again, it falls on Jonathan. And Jonathan noble as ever, is going to essentially offer himself up. But what stuns me is Saul's son has his name come up as the problem here. And Saul said, God, do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. So entrenched is Saul in this situation that he has brought forth because of his hasty decisions that now he looks at his son and says, I guess you're going to have to die because the problem is you. And it is the people, not Saul, the people who finally have had enough and protest against him, and they're saying basically, whoa, slow down here. Shall Jonathan die who has worked this great salvation from Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. They said, we'll pay whatever we got to pay to keep Jonathan alive. And here's the bizarre finale. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. You don't even hear Saul's response to that, right? You don't even know what Saul... They said, we're not going to let him die. And Saul said, all right. And then the chapter ends, lastly, with this note. There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself. Saul had such a fear about losing what he had that anytime he saw anybody with some strength, he said, I need to get this person on my side so that I can stay in my position of power so I don't have to square off against them. He's latching on to people here, there, and everywhere. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that is one of the most dramatic chapters in the Bible. You've got this daring military operation. You've got a king who is just throwing out decisions and indecisions at will. You've got a father who's looking at his son and saying, guess you got to die because of my choices. I mean, this is just such a bizarre story. But what I want to talk about today is chaos that can happen in your home, chaos that can happen in your leadership outside of your home as well. And I'd like for us to consider this passage through that lens. Now, I'm going to use the language of parenting on the slides, but if you're not a parent or if you want to think about it as a parent and as a leader, you can substitute that in a lot of these slides. But I just want to basically tell you the story through the lens of Saul's parental choices and his leadership of Israel. The first thing that we need to understand is that passive parents don't know where their kids are. And I'm talking about in a spiritual sense here. It's true in a physical sense as well. But Saul did not know that Jonathan had gone out to fight. He had no idea of the plan that Jonathan had come up with. That should say verse 1. He did not tell his father. His father didn't know. His father was literally sitting under the pomegranate trees, right, as the battle's going on around him. Jonathan, in this case, was so spiritually superior to Saul that Saul didn't know where Jonathan was spiritually. But the case could also be in the opposite. And David's story tells this in a way of a child that is spiritually becoming further and further from God, and yet the parent is, or the parents are, sort of passively not paying attention to what is going on beyond do we cover the basic physical needs. And passive parents don't know where their children are. Passive leaders don't know where their people are either. I mean, you can see how you can make that point in both ways. In verse 17, Saul has to ask, where did the two that are missing go? Who's not here? And they find out that it's Jonathan. Here's the next thing. Then they make rash decisions that are not actually addressing the spiritual needs of the family. Think about this. Saul had no clue how to handle this situation, but he saw something happening with Jonathan and the Philistine camp, and he starts just throwing out the first thing that comes to his mind. Let's call for the ark. Let's go into battle. Let's not eat anything for the rest of the day. I don't know about you, but maybe as a parent, Okay, let me restart that. Let me say this differently. It has not taken me very long of being a parent to know that my first instinct is not always the right instinct. Now, you as a parent, I'm sure you didn't have that problem, right? But for me, I find that there's actually a lot of wisdom, right, in saying, let's take a step back here and think about this for a second before making a rule. You know, we as parents, we make a lot of rules, and rules are necessary and good, but when we make them quickly without thinking about the consequences of that choice, sometimes we make them quickly because even we're just frustrated and we want an immediate fix for it. But it doesn't actually address a real spiritual need. That happens, right, in our experience. We do that as leaders too. We just go for the thing that comes immediately or the quickest and hope that will solve the problem, and many times it won't. So these unwise choices or rules that we make, they're often the result of deep fears within the heart of a parent or a leader. Now, Steve Wages talked a lot about this, and I'm not going to rehash that all. But if you were to describe King Saul in one way, it would be an easy choice for me to say, here's a man who has a ton of fears. Here's a man who has unresolved fears. Saul conducts his whole life, his whole kingship, out of a desperate need for the people to approve of him. A desperate need for people to like him and to nearly worship him, but to support him. And anytime he has to make a tough decision, he can't do it because he needs people's support. He needs to have the public and the public opinion in his favor in the popularity contest. He can't allow David to be a soldier that kills 10,000 in war because he can only kill 1,000, right? Instead of looking at David and saying, I have a wonderful, mighty warrior that's fighting along with me. He can't allow David to be there because David is, in his mind, in competition with him. Anyway, if you look at most of the decisions that we make like this that are not beneficial for our families or our workplace or some other organization that we're a part of, a lot of times we make knee-jerk reactions because we have a deeper fear. And so maybe the situation is not that I'm really afraid of my child, doing this thing that he shouldn't do in our living room. Maybe my real fear is my child won't listen to me. And so I feel like I need to really make sure he listens to me in this one exact moment. But I create some rule for that reason. This is all hypothetical. That was a joke. Okay. But you see, really we operate based on our fears when we operate without reflection and when we operate without reliance upon the Lord. Saul is passive and he hesitates to do what's right. He neglects to seek God when he does need clarity. He accuses the people for basically doing what Samuel accused him of doing a little while earlier. And he's so addicted to people's perception of him, the rest of his life just continues to reveal that. So, since these choices that we make are not wise, children or people that we're leading, they rebel against those rules, those choices. Now, Jonathan didn't do it willingly, but based on what you read about Jonathan in this passage, he might have done it even if he knew what Saul said, right? He's the guy who said, I'm going to go to war without my father's consent because it's what needs to be done. But nevertheless, he takes that honey and he eats it, and he breaks the rule. But what happens as a result of this unwise rule is that it actually pushes all of the people to go and actually break the law, right? They reject the godly wisdom of cooking your food, basically, And so that one little choice led to a lot more spiritual damage than Saul could have anticipated. And yet, even still, we can refuse to acknowledge that it is our poor leadership that led to the chaos. Saul is more than willing to blame the people of Israel for his own failures. Saul is more than willing, even, it appears, to let his son die because of his poor leadership decisions and his poor parenting choices in terms of his relationship with Jonathan. In fact, it is easier for us to be angry with our children or with others than it is for us to reconcile with who we are and our mistakes. And we make other people pay because we're unwilling to pay, because we're unwilling to look into our own hearts. Sometimes, in Saul's case, even a nation protesting against us wouldn't dissuade us of anything. But as I read this story and reflect on this story, I go back to think about Jonathan and I think about Jesus. And you know, we heroize when we read the Bible sometimes, which is okay. But I read this story and the thought dawns on me that I don't really want this lesson to be to you just about being a Jonathan instead of being a Saul. I do want it to be that. I want me to aim to be more like Jonathan. He's a man of great faith. But I realize that I need a Jonathan because I am a Saul. I need a Jonathan because I am Saul. I haven't made any rules about not eating honey, right? But you and I know that we have made choices that have contributed to our own lack of spiritual thriving, but also have contributed to difficulties for our children, for those around us in our workplace, for those around us in our community, and whatever, extended family, whatever the setting is. I actually need a Jonathan because I am a Saul. And what I mean is, I need somebody who goes alone into the battle because I'm too afraid. I need somebody who goes alone into the battle because I'm under the pomegranate tree wondering what should be done. And I'm just guessing that you as a parent or grandparent, I'm guessing there's times in your life where you're sitting there going, I really don't know exactly what to do, right? And you need somebody who will go alone into that battle when you're too afraid and don't know what to do. I need somebody who comes to me kind of like Jonathan does when he tastes the honey and he says, my father has done something bad. He's made a bad choice. I need somebody who holds me accountable, like Jesus holds me accountable, who says that choice was just not a very good one. I need somebody who says, let me teach you to enjoy the honey that God graciously provides, right? I need somebody to come alongside like Jesus does with the Pharisees so many times and say, snap out of it, look and enjoy what God has given you. But most of all, I need somebody who will say what Jonathan says at the end of this story. When Jonathan's name is called, when Jonathan stands before the people of Israel, and he declares, here I am, I will die. I need somebody who will stand in my place and say, here I am, I will die. And the beauty of the gospel is that in this case of 1 Samuel 14, the crowd of people said, no, it shouldn't be. Don't let Jonathan live. But the power of the gospel is that when Jesus came to do precisely that, you and I, represented in the past by all of these other people, we didn't say, this man shouldn't die. We said, crucify him, crucify him. And he said, here I am, I will die. And it is through his death that our name has been cleared. And it's through his resurrection that we have hope even as we stumble our way through life and we make good choices and bad choices. And it's through his ongoing work in our lives that we are pointed and led in a way, a path, a lifestyle that is constantly leading us closer to the image of Christ and closer to transformation to be like Christ in our lives. And this morning, I just want to ask you to consider, in what ways are you Saul? In what ways is your life revealing that you are Saul? And maybe you're here this morning and you realize that you've been Saul at every turn in your life and chaos has abounded at every turn in your life. And you're saying, I want to give my life to Christ because I need a Jonathan, right? I need a better Jonathan. I need somebody who will lead me, somebody who will direct me not just in the rules, but will lead me to honey, will lead me to joy, And I need somebody who's willing to pay the price that I couldn't pay, who will say, here I am, I will die. And if that's you this morning and you want to be immersed into Christ and you're ready to commit to following Him throughout your life, we'll offer you the invitation to come as we stand and sing.